A homeless girl sang in court, and exposed the truth. Sometimes, you don't need to scream or shout to make the world listen. There are souls who, with just a trembling whisper of a song, can silence the entire universe. In the cold alleys where people become invisible, names are forgotten, and compassion is a luxury, there are still quiet sounds knocking gently on the doors of our hearts. This is not the story of a musical genius. Not a fairy-tale miracle. But a vivid account of a homeless girl, a lullaby long abandoned, and a song not sung for entertainment, but for survival. And above all, this is the story of a forgiveness that dissolved a lifetime of mistakes. Winter had arrived in the city, and the rain poured like it meant to flood the soul. Icy drops whipped across faces as people hurried, heads down, braced against the wind. In a corner of Capitol Hill, Washington, D.C., the restaurant Mahen's Classic Dine glowed warmly in the dreary night like a dying ember in a sea of fog. At that moment, no one noticed the little girl standing beside the dumpster behind the restaurant. Her clothes were muddy and torn, her hair drenched and matted across her face. Her tiny bare feet stood motionless on the freezing cement. But her eyes, if you dared to look closely, burned like a hidden flame in the darkness. Daniel, a 17-year-old busboy rushing to take out the trash, saw her. "What are you doing here?" he asked, not harshly, but confused. The girl looked up, didn't speak. Her lips barely moved. "Are you hungry?" Daniel asked again. She nodded. And in that moment, he didn't know why, he said, "If you sing me a song, I'll ask the chef to get you something to eat." She didn't respond right away. Then slowly, she brushed the wet hair from her face, and began to sing. No instruments. No audience. No stage. Just the steady drum of rain on metal rooftops, and a melody soaked in sorrow, rising into the night. It didn't sound like a child's voice. It echoed like the memory of someone who had lost their mother, slept under bridges, trembled while begging for a piece of bread. Daniel froze. Inside the restaurant, forks and knives fell silent. Diners turned their heads. Conversation stopped mid-laugh. An old man holding a soup spoon silently began to cry. No one understood how a voice so technically imperfect could pierce straight through the shell around each heart. Daniel rushed back inside, grabbed a plate of hot food, and returned. But the girl was still singing. Eyes closed. Lips blue, but each word rang out like a prayer from someone who had lived through hell. And when she reached the final word, "Mama," the entire restaurant went still. At that moment, the front door burst open with a bang. A gust of wind swept in. A man in an expensive raincoat stepped inside, carrying a leather briefcase, face blank. It was Richard Mahen, the restaurant's owner. But when his eyes met the girl's, the briefcase dropped. Silence. The girl opened her eyes and smiled. A sad, knowing smile. The kind of smile from someone who always knew that one day, someone would recognize her. Even if only for a second. The kitchen lights at Mahen's still shone, but now they felt like polished lies. Daniel stepped back in, placed the food on the counter, then turned to the small window where the girl still stood, like a soul caught between worlds. Richard Mahen didn't move. He didn't ask questions. He didn't give orders. He didn't approach. He just stared at the child like the past had clawed its way out of the grave. A few seconds later, he turned without a word and walked up the stairs to his private office. The briefcase remained on the floor. No one dared to pick it up. Daniel rushed out with the hot plate. The girl had stopped singing. The rain still fell, but the tension had vanished. "What's your name?" Daniel asked softly, as if speaking to something fragile. She didn't answer. Just looked at him, eyes dry, lips trembling. Then she sat down by the wall and began to eat slowly, gently, as if every grain of rice was sacred. Daniel was stunned. He'd seen plenty of street people before, beggars, the homeless, but this girl was different. Not just because of her voice, but because of her silence. The kind of silence born from too much pain. As if she had learned long ago that the world doesn't listen unless you have something to sell. A talent. A voice. A wound. That night, after closing, Daniel did something he'd never done before. He let a stranger sleep in the storage room. He cleaned a corner, found an old blanket, placed a tiny pillow on a dusty chair. "You can sleep here. It's safe," he whispered. She nodded. Didn't ask why. Didn't say thanks. As if she was used to hiding. Used to surviving. Used to being unseen. As Daniel walked away, he heard something. A soft melody behind him. She was humming the same song, but slower, deeper. Like a lullaby for herself. He didn't understand why his heart clenched. But a part of him, one he'd never named, knew. He had just stepped into a story far bigger than his 17 years. Upstairs, in his office, Richard Mahen sat under a dim yellow lamp. His hands trembled. In one of them, a phone call was ending. His voice, rough and shaky, said, She came." On the other end, silence. Then a choked sob. Richard put the phone down. His forehead was wet with sweat. He stared out the window into the darkness behind the restaurant, where the girl was now asleep. The night had thickened. But he knew, though he couldn't see clearly, she was still there. And the past was there too. Standing beside her. Singing the song he had tried to bury all his life. The next morning, rain still sprinkled over Washington. Not cold, but the chill came from the silence shared by those under the same roof. Daniel arrived early. He went straight to the storage room, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the girl sat curled beside an old crate. She wasn't singing, but her lips moved, counting breaths to stay present. Daniel placed a bowl of warm porridge. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked. She nodded. Then, softly, whispered, "Who is he?" Daniel paused. "Who?" She looked toward the ceiling where Richard Mahen's office sat above. "The man who dropped the briefcase. The one who looked at me like he'd seen a ghost." Daniel bit his lip. Didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to say. But he knew this wasn't just about food or shelter anymore. The girl had stumbled into a part of the restaurant's past. And maybe, of Richard's own history. At 10 a.m., Richard appeared in the dining room. He looked worn. Eyes sunken, shirt wrinkled, tie half untied. Staff whispered, he didn't sleep last night. No one asked why. But Daniel watched him closely. Richard, in turn, stared at an old photo on the wall. A girl on a small stage, holding a mic, smiling brightly. Beneath the frame, Radha Mahen, the first voice of Mahenstein. Daniel had seen it 100 times. But today, when he glanced at the girl in the storage room, the eyes matched. The hidden sorrow behind the innocence. Even her voice, soft like wind through mountain pines, pierced the soul. It clicked. And Daniel's heart pounded. By noon, customers filled the tables. Food was served as usual. But the air hung heavy like a storm between two clouds. Richard sat at his usual table in the center, visible to all, yet untouchable. Then, the unthinkable happened. The girl walked out. No one called her. No one told her to. But she walked head high, hair still damp, bare feet against tile, eyes like storms cutting the sky. She stood in the center and sang. No music. No microphone. Just a new song. One no one had ever heard. But the first line stopped every spoon mid-air. Someone once called me daughter, but never called me human. No one moved. Richard stared, stunned. Daniel gasped as if someone had torn the curtain from the past. Her voice wasn't a lullaby anymore. It was a reckoning. An indictment. A chant that hit the soul. Then she looked straight at Mahen as she sang. You closed the door. But I'm still here. Because someone inside me refuses to be silent. Wind swept in from the back door. A glass trembled on a table. Mahen stood. Staggered. Then rushed out of the dining room. No words. No backward glance. Just the sound of a door slamming behind him. Daniel ran after him. When he reached the office, Richard was standing by the window, pale as a ghost. In his hand was another photo, old, faded. A young woman holding a baby girl, just a few months old. On the back, blue ink handwriting now smudged and blurry. Lale, daughter of Radha. Daniel said nothing. He simply walked over and placed his hand on the desk. That girl, she's your granddaughter, isn't she? Mahen didn't answer. He just sank into the chair, head bowed. No words were needed. Because the past, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back to sing in the middle of a crowded dining room. After Mahen walked out, a strange silence fell over the restaurant. No one dared speak above a whisper. A few diners stood up to pay, then sat back down, still staring at the little girl. The child whose unaccompanied song had frozen the room. Lale was still standing there. Her tiny hands clutching the hem of her shirt. Her eyes weren't teary, but Daniel knew. Behind those eyes, a sea had already reached the edge. No applause. No photos. Only silence. Because something inside each person had just been pulled out of hiding. That afternoon, Daniel made Lale a cup of hot chocolate and placed it in front of her in the storage room. Is your real name Lale? He asked gently. She nodded, still looking down. And your mom, who was she? Silence. Then, after a long while, Lale finally looked up. Her voice soft as the breeze over a still lake. My mom's name was Radha. She sang beautifully. She used to say, your voice sounds like mine, just a little more broken. Daniel felt his heart tighten. Do you know anything about Mr. Mahen? He asked, cautiously. Lale turned to the window, watching the raindrops slide down like stretched out tears. He used to be my mother's father. Daniel froze. But one day, he locked the door. Mom stood outside. She knocked for a long time. But no one opened. The story was simple. But the pain needed no elaboration. Daniel didn't know how to react. He silently pulled out the photo Mahen had left behind. Have you ever seen this picture before? Lale glanced at it, then reached for it. Her trembling fingers brushed the woman's face. Her lips moved. That's my mom, when she sang at the Buddha's birthday ceremony. Daniel blinked, surprised. Your mom sang at a temple? Lale nodded. She said, "A sincere song is like a prayer. Not because it sounds good, but because there's nothing left to hide." Those words left Daniel speechless. She didn't say anything more. But in that moment, Daniel understood. Lala's voice wasn't just sound. It was an embodiment. It was incense. It was a chant for a soul that had never found peace. The soul of a mother left behind outside a closed door. That night, Daniel went upstairs again. But the office was locked. No light. No sound. Only a small note slid under the door. No entry. No questions. No words. "Time's up." Daniel picked it up, unsure whether to keep it or tear it apart. All he knew was, the man inside that room was now facing something no one ever teaches you how to face. A child who knows the truth and doesn't need your confession. Night fell. The restaurant lights went out. Daniel quietly brought Lala a thicker blanket and some fruit. But when he opened the storage room, he found her sitting there, holding a torn notebook, writing. "What are you writing?" Lala didn't look up. Her voice was light as mist. "A song with no music." "What's it about?" "About someone who closed the door on his daughter, and forgot that a voice doesn't need a key." Daniel said nothing. He simply sat beside her, looking into the darkness behind the restaurant, where memories hovered, waiting for the day they'd be sung aloud. The next afternoon, while Daniel was cleaning the storage room, his hand pulled back an old tarp covering a pile of boxes. He heard a faint clink. Something metallic hitting the floor. Bending down, Daniel found a small wooden box. Moldy. Warped. The lock rusted shut. He hesitated. But something stronger than logic nudged him forward. A gut feeling. That whatever was inside would answer the questions in Lala's eyes. After some careful prying, the box opened. Inside were fragments of a buried past. A tiny white dress, slightly torn, smelling of mildew. A pair of faded plastic sandals, baby-sized. A bundle of crayon drawings. A son, a woman holding a baby girl, a tiny heart in the corner. And a silver necklace, fragile but glowing strangely in the dark. Daniel picked it up. On the pendant, a name engraved deeply. Radha. In that moment, the air seemed to freeze. The wind through the storage creaked with icy chill. Daniel's heart pounded like festival drums but without joy. Only shock. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This was proof. He brought the necklace to Lala, who was sitting by the back window, sketching with a blunt pencil. A girl with long hair singing in the rain. Daniel sat beside her and placed the necklace in her hand. "Is this yours?" Lala didn't respond at first. She took it, then slowly, gently pressed it to her chest. Her body shook. "This was my mom's." Her voice didn't crack. But her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. Daniel saw her eyes redden, but no tears fell. Maybe because the ones inside had frozen long ago in solitude. "Do you remember wearing it?" Daniel asked, hoping to ground her. "When I was little. In a foster center. Mom said it was a charm to protect me. But one day, someone ripped it away. I thought I'd never find it again." Daniel's throat tightened. "I found it in a box. Right here in this room." His eyes locked on hers. "I know," Lala whispered. "Everything here used to belong to my mom. I recognize the smells. The corners. And him. Mr. Mahen. Lala nodded. I don't remember his face. But when he walked in, my heart felt like it had seen a ghost. Not because I was scared, but because I'd been abandoned by that ghost before. Daniel went still. He remembered what older staff had said. That Mr. Mahen once had a daughter. That she vanished. And that no one dared bring it up because he'd explode at the name Radha. Daniel rushed up to the office. This time, the door was unlocked. Richard Mahen sat in the dark. The only light came from his phone screen, casting shadows across his sunken face. Daniel stepped in, holding the necklace. Do you recognize this? Mahen looked up. For a split second, his eyes widened like he'd seen an actual ghost. No words. Just raw fear. It belonged to Radha, didn't it? Daniel pressed. Mahen reached out. Then flinched, as if the necklace burned him. Daniel didn't let him speak. That girl is Radha's daughter. Your granddaughter. And you've known it from the start. Mahen didn't deny it. He didn't defend himself. He just muttered, as if finally exhaling a sin long held. I, once, closed the door, on my own daughter. Those words rang out like the first bell in an abandoned temple. How many closed doors can a lifetime contain? How long can a father forget the sound of his child's voice? And can a child sing her very first song from the silence behind a door that never opened? Mahen sat silently in his office. The silver necklace still lay on the desk, catching the light like living proof of everything he had tried to deny. Daniel didn't take his eyes off him. Not out of anger, but out of waiting. For a confession. For redemption. Or maybe, for Mahen to simply act like a father, just once. Mahen let out a long sigh. A breath that seemed to come from the fossilized core of a broken heart. Radha was everything to me, my only daughter. He didn't look at Daniel. He was looking through time. As if the memories in his mind were more vivid than the world before him. She was different, even as a child. Didn't like math. Didn't follow the path I laid out. She only wanted to sing. All day long. She once told me, the voice is the only place where a person can't lie. Daniel remembered Lolly had said something very similar. Mahen continued. I poured everything into opening this restaurant. I wanted Radha to take it over. But she was lost in music. And then one day, she told me she was pregnant. He paused. His face twisted like he'd swallowed something sharp. The man was married. A drifting musician. I couldn't accept it. Not because of her, but because I was afraid. Afraid of how society would laugh at me. The words hung in the air like a dull knife. Daniel clenched his fists. And what did you do? He asked. Mahen lowered his head. I told her if she walked out that door, never come back. Daniel went still. And when she didn't come back, did you look for her? I did, Mahen whispered. After some time, I started sending money. But the checks came back. I thought, they had died. Or moved far away. I didn't dare look deeper. Didn't dare? Or didn't want to? Daniel asked, losing patience. Both, Mahen admitted, his voice hoarse. I learned to live without saying her name. I told my wife Radha had gone to study abroad. Then, it all slowly faded into the dark. Daniel felt a sharp pain not for Mahen, but because he was starting to understand something terrifying. Some people don't destroy with violence, but with a silence that lasts an entire lifetime. And now, your daughter is gone. And your granddaughter is standing in front of you, singing. And you still choose silence. Mahen trembled. I'm afraid, again. If I claim her, everything will come out. My wife will know. Everyone will know I cast Radha out over pride. And if the girl demands inheritance, I dash. You're more afraid of losing your name than losing a soul. Daniel cut in. That little girl grew up in shelters, in dark alleys. And still, all you think about is yourself. Mahen didn't reply. Silence. The kind that fills statues plated in gold, but hollow inside. That night, Daniel returned to his small room, but couldn't sleep. He opened his phone and replayed recordings of Lala singing. Some had no words, just melody, just breath. And suddenly, he realized. Lala had never complained. She only sang. As if her voice was the only message she had left for the world. Daniel remembered something his mother once read from the Lotus Sutra. Those who speak with malice will hear their own karma echo back at them. Mahen had already heard the echo. The question was, would he finally listen? Or keep running? The next morning, Daniel went to the storage room. Lala was still by the window, doodling. He sat beside her in silence. After a while, he placed the necklace in her hand. He admitted it, Daniel said. Lala didn't look surprised. She just asked softly. Did he cry? Daniel nodded. Then, he still has a heart. Lala whispered, then turned away. Daniel said nothing. But one thought echoed inside him. If a child can forgive, what's stopping an adult from seeking forgiveness? That afternoon, the Washington sky stayed gray, but the rain held back. A kind of stillness filled the air, like the world waiting for something to begin. In a quiet corner of Mahen's restaurant, Lala stood up to sing again. No one asked her to. No one suggested it. She simply walked to the old stage. Once used for weekend music nights. A broken mic lay on the floor, long abandoned. But Lala didn't need it. Her voice rose again. This time, no bitterness. No sorrow. Just a light tune, simple as a morning bird. And yet, each note made people set down their forks, tilt their heads, and feel grateful to simply be alive. At that exact moment, an older man with graying hair looked up from his salad. Benjamin Rowe, columnist for Washington Herald's Voices from the Streets. He didn't even realize when he stopped chewing. Lala finished her song, bowed, and returned to the kitchen. Benjamin stood, walked over to Daniel. That girl, who is she? Daniel paused, then answered. She was abandoned. But her voice found its way back. Benjamin didn't ask more. He simply said, wait for me. I'll be back soon. 3 days later, the Washington Herald ran a front-page story titled, Voice from the Storage Room, the story of a nameless child silencing an entire city. Below was a photo of Lala singing. Eyes lifted, as if calling someone from another world. She never knew the picture was taken. The article didn't name her. Didn't mention the restaurant. But it captured her voice, the meals she sang for, and a vague story of a mother cast aside. Within 24 hours, the piece was shared over 100,000 times. The comments flooded in. I cried when I read the line, you closed the door, but I'm still here. Where is this girl? I want to help. Music is the only thing that truly survives after everything else falls apart. Benjamin Rowe never expected his piece to become a bell that woke a tired city drowning in cold news. At Mahen's, peace was no more. Customers poured in. Not for food, but to find something in themselves. Will the girl be singing again today? Does she need anything? We're from a volunteer music center. We'd love to meet her. As for Mahen, he said nothing. He stayed in his office, watching the crowds below through the window. Like a man witnessing a parade he could no longer join. His wife, Camilla, began to suspect something too. The glances, the whispers, the growing silences between them. One afternoon, she placed the newspaper on his desk and asked, "That girl, is she connected to Radha?" Mahen froze, trying to appear calm. "I don't know. Maybe." But Camilla's eyes changed. As if she'd just smelled a lie rising from the very man she once shared a bed with. "If you know and didn't tell me, then you didn't just betray your daughter. You betrayed me too." The words hit like 1,000 bricks. And Mahen had no defense. Because the truth was, he knew. From Lala's eyes. From her voice. From the necklace. He had known from day one. He just didn't want to. That night, Lala sang again. But this song was different. No one had heard it before. She stood up, eyes distant, and sang about an old wooden door, a leaky roof, a voice that had gone silent, and a man who never opened the door. In the final chorus, she sang one name 3 times. Mahen. 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 No blame. No anger. Just a distant calling. Not to accuse, but to ask. Is there anyone left inside you who's still alive? The crowd held its breath. And Mahen, sitting in the farthest row, stood up. Not out of emotion, but because he suddenly felt a new kind of fear. Truth was coming. Not with force, but with song. And no one could stop it anymore. The next morning, Mahen's restaurant felt like a stage waiting for a storm. Guests arrived earlier than usual. Not for breakfast, but to hear that voice. The voice that had appeared on the front page, in hundreds of short video clips now circulating across social media. Even reporters showed up. Some brought no cameras, only notepads. As if witnessing an unofficial trial. But the one everyone was waiting for, Lala, didn't appear. Daniel entered the kitchen and saw her sitting alone, her hands resting on a blank sheet of paper. She was writing something, but it didn't seem to be a song. It was a letter. "Aren't you going to sing today?" Daniel asked. Lala didn't look up. She simply whispered, "Today. I won't sing just because they expect it. Today, I have to sing, because someone wants me to be silent." Daniel understood. She wasn't confronting the crowd. She was confronting control. At 9:30 a.m., Mahen slammed his hand on the table in front of all the staff. His eyes burned not with authority, but with the fear of being exposed. "Starting today, that girl is not allowed on stage. No singing. And she must leave after closing hours." No one responded. No one dared look at him. Daniel stood at the back, gripping a dish towel tightly. "That girl is turning this place into a circus. Don't you get it? People come here to eat, not to hear sob stories." Just then, Camilla, his long silent wife, stepped forward from the back. "Maybe the only one telling a sob story here is you," she said, her voice cold as ice. Mahen turned, startled. What are you afraid of, Mahen? That people will find out your daughter died in the silence you built. Or that they'll love a child more than they've ever loved you. The room thickened. Daniel held his breath. Staff looked down. But Mahen exploded. That girl must leave. Today. He pointed at Daniel. If you won't take her out, I'll call the police. Daniel didn't argue. He simply pulled a folded letter from his pocket. Lala's letter, written that very morning. She asked me to give you this. Mahen snatched it. Opened it. Tiny handwriting, slightly crooked, but clear. I don't want to cause trouble. I just wanted to stand where my mother once stood. If that bothers you, I'll leave. But I will not apologize for singing. Because my voice is the last thing my mother left me. Lala. Mahen trembled. The letter slipped from his hand, spiraling down to the floor. Daniel didn't wait. He turned and walked back toward the kitchen, where Lala was waiting. He didn't say anything. But I think it's your choice now. Lala stood. Her eyes were no longer sad. They shone brighter than ever. She didn't exit through the back. She walked straight to the stage. The room erupted. Some people applauded. Others pulled out their phones. But Lala raised her hand, signaling for silence. And then, she sang. Not an old song. Not something from a headline. But a prayer. A melody so simple, so slow. It felt like a bell ringing through aching hearts. I don't need a name. I don't need a chair. Just a small corner to sing. For the one who's no longer here. At that moment, no one noticed Mahen standing at the back of the room. He didn't step forward. He didn't leave. He just stood there. Like a ghost summoned by a voice. Like a soul still wandering, waiting for release. Lala ended the song with a final line. Those who stayed silent before the truth will hear it one way or another. She bowed. Not to the crowd, but as if bowing to someone far, far away. Her mother. As she stepped down, Mahen was still there. Daniel thought he'd speak. But he turned away. Slowly. As if each step was crushing a part of himself. No one stopped him. No one followed. Because from that day forward, the truth wasn't behind him anymore. It was standing center stage, singing to the world. Lala left Mahen's the next morning. No goodbye. No tears. Just a small backpack, a notebook, and the journal where she wrote her songs. Daniel walked her to the back door, eyes red, but didn't ask her to stay. I could come with you, he whispered. Lala shook her head. This place needs you. I need the sky. Daniel didn't fully understand. But he nodded. Because some journeys, even the ones closest to you, cannot walk beside. Lala headed toward Union Station. The noisy city didn't notice another wandering child. She walked softly, fading into the crowd without a sound. Until a homeless newspaper vendor, hunched near the station entrance, looked up. Do you sing, child? Lala stopped. Looked at him with gentle eyes. Who would I sing for? The man chuckled through a cough. For those nobody bothers to listen to. And right there, among the trains, loudspeakers, and rushing footsteps, Lala began to sing. No mic. No stage. Just the concrete, a rusty pole, and a backpack used as a seat. She sang about those without beds. without doors to knock on, without names to be called. A college student filmed it, posted the video on TikTok with the caption, "This girl sings in the station like she's praying." Within 8 hours, the video hit 2 million views. Small media outlets started chasing the story. But it went viral when Benjamin Rowe, the journalist, reposted the video on Twitter with the caption, "This is the girl from Voice from the Storage Room. And now, she's singing to the world." The hashtag Lala the Voice trended across all platforms. People who had been to Mahen's began sharing, "I heard her sing. I've never cried in a restaurant until that day. If anyone deserves a real stage, it's this girl. Truth can't be buried, it will sing its way out." That night, Daniel got a call. "Lala, turn on the TV," she said. "I think they can't ignore me anymore." Daniel flipped to the local channel. And there it was, a special news segment. Footage of Lala singing at Union Station. The angle wasn't perfect. The sound mixed with train noise. But her eyes glowed like a candle in a storm. The anchor ended with a question. Is this just a short-lived touching story? Or is it the beginning of something more? A real awakening? In another corner of the city, Mahen sat motionless in front of his laptop. The entire office was dark. On the screen, a video replayed Lala's song at the train station. When she sang the final lines, "And if no one wants to call my name, I will sing, so I can hear myself." Mahen couldn't hold back anymore. His eyes turned red. His hands trembled as he opened a drawer and pulled out a small box filled with old letters. Inside, dozens of unsent letters, written to Radha. Each one penned after seeing a child laugh, or hearing a voice that reminded him of hers. He picked up one letter with shaking hands and read, "My daughter, I was wrong. But I never stopped missing you. If one day you come back, please forgive this weak man." Radha never received those letters. But now, Lala was receiving the whole world. The next day, Mahen appeared at Daniel's doorstep. He knocked gently. When Daniel opened the door, Mahen couldn't look him in the eye. "Is she okay?" Daniel stared at him for a long moment. "She's singing, even for the people who once tried to silence her." Mahen pressed his lips tightly. Then said, eyes still averted, "I want to meet her." Daniel paused, thinking. Don't go as a former employer, or a father who once abandoned her. Go, as someone who needs forgiveness. Mahen nodded, his eyes bloodshot. And if she doesn't forgive me? Daniel smiled gently. Then you'll still hear her voice every day, in the silence. Because the truth never stays silent for long. Sunday. Mahen's was closed, as usual. Daniel went into the storage room with a simple intention. To sort through the boxes Lala once used. Maybe to keep something as a memory. Or just to hold on to the feeling that she was still here. But as he rearranged the old wooden crates in the corner, he discovered something strange. A small brass key, attached to a torn piece of paper that read, Office Safe, July 2018. Daniel froze. It was the safe in Mahen's private office. A cabinet no one, not even Camilla, had ever been allowed to open. That same unexplainable pull returned, like the one he felt when he found Radha's necklace. Once again, he stood before a locked door, key in hand, heart pounding. The safe was hidden behind a large framed painting. A portrait of Mahen receiving the Outstanding Culinary Entrepreneur of 2010 award. Daniel quietly slid the painting aside and inserted the key. Click. It opened more easily than he expected. Inside, no cash. Just a stack of files. Too neat. Too organized. Suspiciously so. Daniel pulled them out one by one. Property transfer documents. Bank statements. Power of attorney forms, all signed by Camilla Mahen. The problem? Camilla had never once mentioned any of these transactions. One file stood out. Real estate partnership agreement, sale of 50% Mahenstein shares for investment into new restaurant chain. Signed by Camilla Mahen. Recipient, Mahen and Partners LLC, owned by Mahen himself. Daniel flipped to the final page and saw two disturbing details. One, the receiving account was offshore outside U.S. banking jurisdiction. Two, Camilla's signature was perfect. But Daniel knew. She never signed anything like this. And if she didn't know, then it meant the entire brand, wealth, and family name were being funneled into the hands of a man willing to forge his own wife's signature. Daniel collapsed into a chair, sweating. His hands shook as he photographed each document, every statement, every legal stamp. Another file made him go cold. A handwritten memo titled, "If Radha reappears, Financial Contingency Plan." Inside were horrifying suggestions. Transfer the girl to an out-of-state educational center, mental health justification. Prevent media contact. Offer to buy guardianship rights, if anyone claims her. Daniel dropped the file. He didn't need to read further. Lala's voice had once been seen as a financial threat. Not a child. Not a granddaughter. But a risk. A liability. A problem to manage. That afternoon, Daniel went to Camilla's home. She was sitting in the living room, reading the newspaper, which featured Lala being nominated to perform at a community music event. "The girl is starting to shine," she said softly, with a faint smile. Daniel nodded, then placed the printed photos on the table. Camilla looked at them. Confused at first. Then she opened the folder. And time seemed to stop. Page by page. Her hands began to shake. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but horror. "I never signed these," she whispered. Daniel replied gently, "I believe you." Camilla stood, trembling. Her hand gripped the file tightly. He didn't just disown his daughter. He tried to erase everything just to hide his guilt. Daniel looked at her, eyes steady. "What will you do?" Camilla didn't answer. But for the first time in years, Daniel saw her stand tall. Like a mother about to step onto a battlefield to reclaim her daughter's voice. That night, the Mahen family's grand old house no longer felt like a quiet fortress. The air inside was thick. As if every wall had begun whispering secrets long buried. Camilla stood in the center of the living room, holding the documents Daniel had given her. Her eyes no longer clouded by years of quiet loyalty. Now, they burned with the clarity of a mother awakened. Mahen came down the stairs, buttoning the cuffs of his robe. His face still wore the expression of a man used to controlling rooms with a glance. But tonight, the woman he faced wasn't just his wife. She was a mountain. "I found these in your safe," Camilla said calmly, but with each word landing like a temple bell. Mahen stopped. His heart sank. "I can explain." Camilla raised her hand. "No need. Because any explanation now is an insult to our daughter. And to me." She laid the documents out on the wooden table. You forged my signature. You transferred assets in my name. And you planned to send our granddaughter away, like she was some dangerous object. Mahen trembled. He had never seen Camilla like this. You cast Radha aside. And now, Lale, her daughter, was nearly erased from this family. Like an ink stain. Camilla reached into her purse and pulled out a worn sheet of paper. Radha's old will. The only copies she'd found in her keepsakes. She read aloud. If I am gone, I want everything to belong to my daughter, Lale. Please don't make her ask for permission to exist. Camilla's voice cracked on the final word. What did you do to that child, Mahen? How can you call yourself a father? Mahen slumped into a chair. His shoulders collapsed. The once proud restaurateur looked like a man who had just seen the ghost of his own soul. You were afraid of bankruptcy, of disgrace, of your past undoing your empire. But you were never afraid of losing your daughter. Camilla sobbed. That is the real crime. The next day, Camilla didn't wear silk or perfume. She wore an old blouse, a wool scarf, and carried a folder as she met Daniel at the train station, where Lale was temporarily staying with a charity group. At that moment, Lale was under the awning, teaching 2 children how to sing a few simple lines. Each word she sang felt like sunlight cutting through fog. Slow, warm, and unforgettable. When Lale saw Camilla, she stood, but didn't run forward. She simply bowed her head. Camilla approached, her eyes full of tears, but her gaze strong and clear. I'm sorry, Lale. I didn't know. But now, I want to know everything. Better late than never, right? Lale didn't respond. She reached into her pocket and held up the old silver necklace. My mother gave me this. Not as a weapon, but to remember I once belonged somewhere. Camilla extended her hand. Then let me become that place. Again. And then, gently, as if afraid of hurting the memory, Lale stepped forward. Camilla opened her arms. For the first time in 10 years, an embrace was offered, instead of denied. That evening, an official statement from Camilla Mahen was sent to media outlets. The Mahen family acknowledges Lale as the biological granddaughter and daughter of the late artist Radha Mahen. All assets left by Radha will be transferred according to her wishes. In addition, we will pursue legal accountability for any acts of forgery, asset misuse, or betrayal of trust, even within the family. The media exploded. A family awakening, in a way no one expected. Mahen gave no response. He simply watched the news report from his darkened office, where light no longer reached. He reread Radha's letter. He listened again to the clip of Lale singing at the train station. And for the first time, he truly cried. Not because of loss, but because he had lived so long without realizing what he had already lost. The court hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. It wasn't raining, but the sky was heavy with gray clouds, like a curtain waiting to be drawn. In front of the District Court of Columbia, dozens of reporters and supporters gathered early. Placards in hand, cameras rolling, large photos of Radha and Lale printed on poster boards. From a homeless child, Lale had become a symbol of abandoned children, of voices once buried. Camilla wore a white blouse and a purple scarf, Radha's favorite color. She held Lale's hand tightly as they passed through the security gate. Daniel followed close behind, never taking his eyes off Lale. She wore a pale blue dress. No makeup, no glitter. But the light from her presence made the courtroom feel sacred. Inside, The judge Celeste Warren, known for her commitment to social justice, sat high on the bench. When the case was called, she looked at Lala. "What is your name, child?" Lala answered, her voice soft but clear. "Lala. No last name." Celeste nodded and took notes. "Today, I want to hear why you believe you need one. And why an entire city is listening." Silence settled across the room. Camilla's lawyer stood, opening the file. Radha's handwritten will. Documents proving Lala's parentage. Hospital records from the day she was born. And most notably forged property transfer files prepared by Mahen, using Camilla's falsified signature. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Celeste called for order. Camilla took the stand. Her voice was low, but firm. "I lost my daughter. And I nearly lost my granddaughter. Not because of an accident. Not because of fate. But because of the silence of the man she once trusted most." She turned toward Mahen, seated with his private attorney. "I loved that man. But now, I must love justice more." A declaration of war. Spoken softly, yet sharp as a blade of moral truth. Then it was Lala's turn. The room held its breath. She stood. No papers. No rehearsed speech. Just a 14-year-old girl stepping up to the stand. "I don't remember my mother's face. But I remember her voice. Because every night, she sang me to sleep. I don't want anyone's pity. I just want to carry her name, Radha. So that when someone asks, 'Who are you?' I can say, 'I'm the daughter of someone who was cast out, but never left my heart.'" Someone sobbed in the back. Judge Celeste leaned forward. "Would you mind singing? If you're comfortable." Lala nodded. The courtroom was no stage. But in that moment, justice and music became one. She sang slowly. Each word felt like it had stepped out of her chest. "My name isn't on paper. It lives in the song my mother left behind. If they ask me who I am, I'm the one still singing. After all the doors have closed." No one spoke for nearly 2 minutes. When she finished, there was no applause. Only silence. The kind of silence that rises above law. The kind that honors truth. Celeste struck the gavel. The court recognizes Lala as the lawful daughter of the late Radha Mahen. She shall inherit all rightful assets, name, and identity. As for the forgery and asset manipulation, a separate investigation will proceed. Mahen bowed his head. Not out of shame, but because he could no longer run from the weight of what he had buried. Camilla turned to Lala and embraced her. "Welcome home, sweetheart." The courtroom stood. Not because the law had won, but because love had been restored. The iron gate of the Mahen family estate opened for the first time in nearly 15 years. To welcome a child once born outside the conversations of grown ups. Camilla stood at the doorway, gripping Lala's hand. Not to pull her in, but to say, "You can walk in whenever you want. No permission needed." Lala looked up at the 3-story brick home. Its windows like silent eyes that once watched her mother walk away in the rain. It wasn't raining now. But something still felt cold inside her chest. Daniel followed behind, carrying her few belongings. A backpack, a box of crayons, and her worn music journal. The door opened. Lala stepped in. Each footstep echoed through the marble hallway. Like memories once swallowed by silence. She touched the wooden staircase. A small scratch along the banister. Camilla said softly. Your mother tripped here the first time she tried to run. Lala turned. Her eyes softened, as if someone had whispered. I'm still here. In every scratch that never healed. Camilla led her to the second floor room, Radha's room. The door had been closed for years. She unlocked it. A faint cloud of dust drifted like the scent of incense on New Year's morning. Everything remained. The old piano covered with sheer cloth. The bookshelf with music theory guides. And one photo on the desk. Radha at 17, holding a microphone, smiling during her last performance before leaving home. Lala walked over. She didn't cry. She simply reached out and touched the frame. As if knocking on a memory. I'll leave your photo here, Mom. And I'll keep writing. Camilla turned away to wipe her tears. Not from sadness. But because the house finally felt alive again. That evening, Camilla prepared Lala's first dinner at home. Not fancy. Just tomato soup and garlic bread, Radha's favorite. Daniel helped set the table. The kitchen glowed a light that had long been used only to warm lonely meals for two. Lala sat down. Before her, an old porcelain plate chipped at the edges. Camilla said. Your mother always chose this one. Because it had a lotus flower on it. Lala bowed her head. The lotus grows from the mud. Camilla smiled. And still smells sweet. After dinner, Camilla handed Lala a small box. Your mother's keepsakes. I kept them. But never had the courage to open them. Lala opened it. Inside. A handkerchief embroidered with Radha in blue thread. A tiny, yellowed diary. And a handwritten piece of music unfinished, only the chorus written. If one day my daughter sings, let her sing with all her heart. Lala closed it gently. She said nothing. But Daniel knew. That was the song she would finish. That night, while the others slept, Lala stood alone in Radha's room. She opened the old piano. Each key she touched let out a faint breath. Like a memory finally released. And then she played. Not a known piece, but a melody born from silence, from tears, and from dreams long held captive. A song of forgiveness. In the room across the hall, Mahen lay awake. His door slightly ajar. He heard every note. And cried unseen. Not because he had repented enough. But because Lala had come home. And she never needed him to open the door. That spring, the annual South DC Community Festival took place at Franklin Elementary School. Once a site for Friday night soup kitchens. But this year, all eyes turned to one person. Lala. From a girl who once sang at train stations for food. She now stood on a makeshift stage. Behind her, a white canvas backdrop read. Sing even when no one wants to hear. Daniel adjusted her microphone. Camilla sat front row, holding a small bouquet, tears in her eyes, smiling. The crowd was packed. Children. Parents. Former Mahen's employees. And strangers drawn by a voice that had gone viral. Lala stepped forward. Soft sunlight bathed her shoulders like an invisible halo. Today, she began. I'm not here to sing a sad story. Today, I sing my mother's song. A song I've completed. Not with words, but with the life she never got to finish. The crowd fell silent. Lala sat at the keyboard. She took a deep breath. Placed her fingers on the keys. And then, the song with no name began. The melody. Slow, gentle, with a prayer-like tone, like a musical meditation. Not sorrowful. Not angry. But as if lifting each pain into the wind's open palm. Lala's voice softly carried the lyrics. Mother didn't get to call my name again. But I still hear her in the rain. Some close doors, some turn away. But none compare to the one still waiting in the yard. I don't wait for a name, or a family. Only a call, from someone who once forgot. If someone fears the truth, then I sing, so they can hear it with their heart. The entire schoolyard, no one filmed. No one raised their phone. Everyone was simply living inside the song. No longer spectators, but witnesses to a moment beyond reality. At the end, Lala paused briefly. She took a deep breath and sang one final line. And if I forgive, then I sing, without anyone needing to bow. But in that exact moment, someone stood. Mahen. He wore an old suit. No tie. Thinner. His hair mostly silver now. No one invited him. No one stopped him. He walked slowly onto the stage. Each step like a journey through his own life. And then, he knelt before Lala. The entire schoolyard held its breath. No applause. No commotion. Just stillness. More sacred than any ceremony. Mahen bowed his head. His voice trembled like a late-season leaf. I didn't come to be forgiven. I came to listen, and live with my mistakes. Lala looked at him for a long time. She didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. She simply stepped forward, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. You've heard it now. You may stand. Mahen looked up. His eyes blurred with tears. For the first time, he didn't see Lala as a granddaughter, but as the person who had saved him from drowning in his past. The ceremony ended, but no one left right away. People stayed, held each other, whispered softly, as if they had just attended a funeral for ego, and a birth ceremony for truth. Daniel stood behind the curtains, eyes red. Camilla placed a hand on his shoulder. Today, Radha is smiling. As for Lala, she sat on the edge of the stage, opened her old notebook, and wrote the final line of the song. The nameless song, written by mother, completed by daughter. 1 month after the Spring Festival. As Lala's story spread across newspapers and online platforms, the Washington, D.C. City Council held a special session. Councilwoman Melinda Chen, once Radha's music teacher at elementary school, stood and spoke, her voice tied with emotion. I propose the establishment of a community center for children without guardians, without identification, and without access to the arts, to be named Lala Voice Center. The entire chamber applauded. The resolution passed unanimously. But when the press asked Lala about this honor, she shook her head. The center doesn't need my name. Call it Voice Without Name. Because there are thousands of kids like me, who've never been called by their name, not even once. And so, an old building was renovated in Southeast DC. It became the Voice Without Name Center. No golden signs. Just a white wall in front, with these handwritten words. If you've never been heard, listen. If you've never been named, speak. Lala didn't become the director. She just became the one who opened the door. Each morning, she prepared old instruments with her own hands, teaching children who had never learned a single note. Kids from shelters, from undocumented families, from the border. None were asked their names. All were given the right to sing. One rainy afternoon in June, Mahen quietly visited the center. He stood outside, wearing an old fabric hat, hoping no one would recognize him. In his hand, a letter he had written weeks earlier. Camilla happened to spot him. She approached. No longer angry. No longer distant. Just one simple question. Who is that letter for? Mahen replied softly. No one. I just want to place it in the library corner, so that anyone who's ever regretted something can know this. Forgiveness doesn't require perfection. Just silence, and the willingness to listen. Camilla nodded. Then go in. And so he did. Not as a failed father. Not as a disgraced businessman. But as someone learning how to love again. Lala saw him, but said nothing. She simply turned back to the children and continued teaching. The most beautiful sound isn't in pitch. It's where someone sings, so they won't be forgotten. Years passed. An Emmy-winning documentary was made, titled The Girl Who Refused to Be Silenced. The interviewer asked 23-year-old Lala, if you could go back to the day you sang at the train station, what would you say to that little girl? Lala looked into the camera without hesitation. I wouldn't say anything. I would just stand still, and listen. Because some children spend their whole lives waiting for someone who's willing to hear them sing. The final scene of the documentary. Hundreds of children stand on the stage at the Voice Without Name Center, singing together the song once called Nameless Song. Among them, Lala stands slightly back. No microphone in hand. Just watching. And smiling. A child tugs at her arm. Sister Lala, whose song is this? Lala leans down and whispers. It was my mother's. But now, it belongs to everyone. Some voices weren't meant to entertain. Not to be recorded. Not to gain fame. But to tell the world. I was here. Even if no one called my name. I still sang. And sometimes, those nameless voices are the ones that awaken a society that had forgotten how to feel. Thank you for joining us. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share. What did this story teach you? How might it shape the way you live or forgive? Your voice matters. Reading your reflections brings strength, healing, and inspiration to us all. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us create more stories that awaken the soul. Thank you for watching. And we'll see you in the next video.